Welcome to Classroom Connections, an opportunity for students in the classroom to connect with educators from Oakland University. On this edition, we're connecting Mrs. Rogers' 5th grade classroom at Pine Knob Elementary with Oakland University Professor of History, George Milne. Now, let's turn it over to Elementary Curriculum Coordinator, Mr. Bob Brazier, in the classroom.
Okay, sounds good. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 5th grade classroom of the incomparable Mrs. Rogers here at Pine Knob Elementary. On today's episode of Classroom Connections, these Pine Knob 5th graders who've been studying the beginnings of our great country will be connecting virtually with Professor Milne of Oakland University. Dr. Milne, whose major areas of interest include Native American history and early American history, will be sharing his expertise and passion with these fortunate 5th graders. 5th grade students attending Clarkston Community Schools begin their study of American history with American Indian peoples before the arrival of European explorers and conclude with the adoption of the Bill of Rights in the year 1791. The year is approximately 1754 in the students' studies at the moment, a clearly vital time. Enter Professor Milne. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today, and take it away.
Hello, everybody. Can you see my screen? Can you see me, first of all?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Do I have any 5th graders out there? I can't hear you. Much better. Much better. I didn't know if I was talking to empty space. Can you see my screen? What does the PowerPoint say? Can anybody read it to me?
Why did Britain and France fight in the French and Indian War?
Excellent, excellent. This is a map that's a lot like the maps that you have in your textbook. The map that you have in your textbook showed what the British North America, French North America, and down here at the bottom we have Spanish North America, Florida, and the Spanish also laid claim to Texas, what's today Texas. But what I want you to look at this map, it's a little different than the map that you saw in your textbook because it's got some things in here that are just a little bit different. And I want you to look at these people here, the Wyandotte. The Wyandotte, can anyone tell me where this is? Where's that arrow pointing to? Very good. Thank you. We have the Shawnees here, the Eastern Abenaki, and the Chickasaws. These are all Native American people, and we're used to looking at maps and saying, oh, well, this is the British section of North America. Here's the French section of North America. And the British and the French used to like to think that they were in charge. But I want you to change your mind a little bit and remember that in places like Michigan, places like Pennsylvania, places like Maine, or places like Mississippi, it was Native Americans who were in charge, and they called the shots. And this is one of the reasons we call this the French and Indian War. And one of the things that I picked up from your textbook is that the French had a lot of Native American allies. So historians answer questions. We try to look at the past and try to make sense of it by using evidence. So what I'm going to do here is use a little evidence and try and make sense of the past. Try and answer a few questions. So could somebody read that question for me?
Why would the Indians want to be friends with the European colonists? Thank you, Serenity.
Okay, good. It's a question, you know, a lot of us look at Native Americans and say, well, why did they let the English or the French live among them? And there were some really good reasons. They had some really good reasons. And one of them was trade. All right, so I'm going to ask you a few questions. Can anyone tell me what this is? Okay, now I'm going to ask you a question. Is this a good trade? I have an Xbox, and this happens to be the top of the line. Can anyone tell me what kind of Xbox this is?
Xbox One XL or Xbox Series.
Yes. Yeah, it's the top of the line. Suppose I said, I'll give you an Xbox, but all I want from you is an old pair of sneakers. Is that a good trade?
No.
Well, it depends what side of the trade you're on, right? If you're the person who has the old sneakers and you're going to get an Xbox, it's a pretty darn good trade. But if I'm the person with the sneakers, you might say, is Professor Milne a little off his rocker? So let me ask you another one. I'm going to show you another trade. Anyone tell me what that is? Okay, suppose I offered a trade like this. An old t-shirt. Would you guys go for it? You would keep an old t-shirt? Somebody said no. Would they keep an old t-shirt? And
I think they
you would keep your old t-shirt?
I
Some old
think
t-shirt.
you the machine if you give him an old t-shirt.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Rogers. I hear you back there. I need help. How about this? Anyone tell me what that is? Okay. Nobody wants one of them, right? How many people want an iPhone? I mean, I have one. So,
Will you give it to us?
will I give you that? Well, how about for an old dollhouse?
Thank you.
So there's a reason I'm making these ridiculous proposals. There's a reason why I'm showing these trades. Nobody in their right mind in 21st century America would trade an old pair of sneakers for an Xbox. But Native Americans had needs that we don't necessarily understand from our 21st century perspective. If you wanted to get an Xbox, where would you go?
Actually, probably like a big gaming store because most stores don't have anything like that.
Yeah, but you could get one at a store. You could order it on Amazon. You could get one, but you would get one from some sort of vendor, a store, or a website, or you might, Xbox is Microsoft. You could order it from Microsoft. But if you lived in Michigan and you were a native person, if you were a Wyandotte, you would depend on the beaver trade. And we have lots of beavers in Michigan now. But I'm going to explain a little bit about Native American trade. So why was the beaver trade important? And what we have here is a native person. I believe she's in Canada, and they call Native Americans, they don't call them Native Americans because they're Canadian, they call them First Nations or First People. And she's got a beaver robe on. She's got about, what it is 8 or 9 beaver skins sewed together. It makes a nice warm robe, keeps you warm in the winter. And if you notice, she's got it turned inside out, so the warm fur is on the inside. Well, Native Americans wore these until they got really old. And believe it or not, the older they got, the more the traders, the more the Europeans who showed up in the Great Lakes wanted them, because the sweat and the grease from the body of Native Americans would wear off the hair and make it very easy to process the beaver skins into things that could be used and made into things like hats. Very popular in Europe at the time. So strangely enough, the older and the stinkier they were, the more valuable they were to the French, the more valuable they were to the English. So just before that woman might be ready to throw that old nasty robe onto the fire or into the garbage dump, a trader comes along and offers them something really good. And again, we want to put our minds into what it was like to live at that time. So Native Americans used to make knives out of flint. And some of the best flint came from Michigan. That's why we have a town named Flint. So Native Americans would trade flint and they would make knives. And you can see these knives are made from flint on the left side. And on the right side, you can see that they have antlers for handles, and they're tied together with sinew that's boiled and then shrunk. So they're really good, they're sharp, but has anybody used any flint or played with any flint in their lifetime? Maybe not, but it's very brittle, it'll break. So that knife might be good for a couple uses. It might be really good for a while, but it will snap and it will wear out. But what if a French trader showed up and they offered you a nice iron or steel knife that never breaks? We have here a stone axe. Again, Native Americans were really good at making stone axes. But what happens if a trader comes along and offers you an iron axe, an axe that never breaks, that you can use and use and use, sharpen and use again? A stone axe, if you try to take down a tree, cut down a tree with a stone axe, it can take a couple days. If you have an iron axe, it might only take you 15 minutes. And that changes things in Native American towns. And here's something here. Can anyone tell me what that is? Right. How many people know who made the pots in Native American societies? Was it the boys or the girls?
Women.
It was the women, right. The women made the pots. But these pots, what's the problem when you have a clay pot like that?
It breaks.
Right. And do you know how they cooked in it?
I don't think
They
they know.
couldn't cook. Go ahead.
I don't think they know that. So tell them how.
Okay.
Listen up, you guys.
You couldn't put that pot on the fire. It would crack on the fire. So what you would take are hot stones, and you would put your food in the pot and then drop the hot stones into the food and let the hot stones warm the food. Takes a long time. It's hard to make, and women were in charge of making these. They taught the older women taught the girls how to do this, and that pot could take several hours to make and then a couple days to fire and get nice and hard. So what if somebody came along and said, I'll take one of those stinky old beaver robes and I'll give you one of these, an iron pot, a pot that doesn't break, a pot you can put right on the fire. And guess what? You don't have to spend all your days digging out clay, building a big fire, keeping it hot enough to cure or to set the clay and make it hard enough to cook out of. So we've got this iron pot here, and you can pick that up, you can carry it with you, it's not going to break, and you can put it right on the fire. Your life is a lot easier. And this is one of the reasons, by the 1750s, Native Americans in the Great Lakes, in really the eastern half of what becomes the United States, were really dependent on trade with Europeans. And here's the big thing. Can anyone tell me what these are?
Guns.
They're muskets, yes. They're guns. They have to be loaded from the top. You would have to load it from, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you load it from the muzzle. And it was a lot easier to hunt with a musket than with a bow and arrow. Has anybody used a bow and arrow? Is it easy? No. Takes a long time to get to know how to use one. A musket, you can learn how to shoot pretty well in a week or two. Whereas with a bow and arrow, it could take you a long time. Most of the boys in this class would be hunting with bows and arrows at your age. You would still, they might not give you a sharp arrow with a stone tip, but they would give you an arrow that was blunt that you could hunt things like squirrels and kill squirrels and bring them home for dinner. So a musket made things much easier. But what do you need to make a musket work, aside from the gun itself? Powder and lead. And Native Americans could not make powder or lead. How do you think they got it? Excellent. Excellent. Are you sure these guys are in 5th grade? You sure they're not 6th or 7th graders? Mrs. Rogers? Okay. They seem really up on things. Okay, so here's a picture of a Native American. It was drawn by a Frenchman, and we can tell because it's written in French, Guerrier Iroquois, or Iroquois warrior. And if we look at this particular picture, We can see he's got a musket. He had to have traded from that because Native Americans didn't have the technology to make a musket. He's got a hatchet, and that had to come from trade because it's made of steel. And something else, he's wearing ribbons, or those ribbons were probably made in a factory somewhere in France, maybe in England, maybe in Germany. And who knows where the beads came from? They might have come from the Czech Republic. So the question is, your book said that the French had a lot of Native American allies. Why were the French so successful with these Indian communities? And I'll try and answer that question again with a little evidence. We'll go back to this map, and we can see up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see these arrows. That's the trade. That's a ship that might be coming in from France with lots of trade goods. And it could travel down the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes, into places like Detroit. Now, it couldn't come directly, but they could offload their ship in Montreal and use canoes to get all the way to Detroit. Another reason, so that meant that the goods coming from France could be very cheap. It's easier to transport them than coming over the Appalachian Mountains. Another reason was that the French tended to break apart, and maybe a few men would move into Native American communities. Sometimes they would marry Native American women. They blended in with Native American communities very well. They learned the languages, and they learned what was valuable. And we can see in this picture, in the middle of the picture, that they have some trade goods that they're trading with Native Americans. And we can also see they've gotten pretty backwoodsy. They're wearing buckskins. They're dressing like Native Americans. The only difference is they have beards. And most Native Americans, my friends who are Indians, they don't have thick beards, whereas Western Europeans tend to have thick beards. Aside from that, they became pretty adept at living among Native Americans. Another reason is something we can see in this fort. Again, we see Native American men who are trading, and in the background we can see a fort. The French did build forts, but that's all they built. They generally used the forts as trading posts, and a lot of the forts were pretty small. We think of forts with lots of soldiers in them. A lot of the French forts only had a dozen, maybe 2 dozen soldiers. A French fort that had 24 soldiers was a big French fort. So the French didn't leave a big footprint. Whereas if we look at the English colonies, they built towns, they built cities, and they left a very big footprint. And that footprint did things like it drove away animals, it made it harder to hunt, and the English brought settlers, and those settlers moved inland. And when they moved inland, they tended to take up Indian land. They didn't ask permission, they just moved in and built. And that caused a lot of friction. So on one hand, if you're a Native American and you have a French trader who comes in with lots of good things that make your life easier, and you have a English colonist, and that colonist moves in with his family and his sheep and his cattle, and they make your life tougher, you're definitely going to side with the French. So I'm going back to this map for a second, and I want you to understand what the English colonists do. And they tend to move inland because they need more land. Those farms that the English build, they're not so good at taking care of the land. The land tends to wear out, and they need new land, so they keep moving inland. And they move into Native American territory. And that pressure causes a lot of friction. And there's one particular move that English colonists, particularly colonists from Virginia, make, and they move into Pennsylvania. At that time, Virginia claimed what is today Pennsylvania. They claimed what is today Ohio, even Michigan. They had a big claim. They thought very big. Now, of course, Native Americans weren't on board with this. So when the English show up, there tends to be some friction. There tends to be battles. And I'm going to bring somebody, I don't know if anybody knows who this is. Can anyone tell me who this is?
George Washington.
Okay, does anybody know how old he is in this painting?
68?
I hear a lot of guessing. He's actually 62 or 63 in this picture. He's an older man and he's president of the United States. In 1754, there was no United States. Nobody was thinking about a United States. What they were thinking about is how to move into the interior, into places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, maybe even as far as Michigan. This is George Washington, and here he's about 25 or 27. He's much younger, and you notice he's wearing a uniform. He's wearing a Virginia militia uniform in this picture. But when he went into Ohio, he was only 21 or 20. And here he is at the age of 20. Does anybody know what he's doing? This is a tricky question, because you won't see people doing this too much anymore. You might see somebody on the side of the road doing this.
Eleanor, what's he doing? Say that a little bit louder.
Measuring the sea level.
That's exactly what he's doing. He's measuring the land. He's surveying. So he was a surveyor. When he was very young, his brother owned Mount Vernon, and he didn't have much money. He had to make a living for himself, and he thought, well, if I go inland and measure out this land, maybe we can sell it, make a claim, and sell it to settlers. Of course, they weren't asking the people who lived there whether that was okay with them, but they did it anyway. But he was a young man, and he knew the area. As a result, the governor of Virginia sent him inland to negotiate with the French, and the French told him, we're not interested. We have a nice fort in what's today Pittsburgh. They called it Fort Duquesne. And when Washington came back with the news, he's only 21 years old, and the governor made him in charge of a large force. So I'm going to show you a picture. I have a question for you. Can anyone guess where these troops are from?
Britain.
Wrong. They're from Virginia. They're Americans. They're wearing red uniforms, but Americans wore red uniforms. You got to remember, there was no United States. We think of American troops wearing blue uniforms during the Revolution, but these weren't troops from an independent country. These were troops from the colony of Virginia, and the man on the horse is George Washington. He's wearing a red uniform. Yeah, it sounds a little strange, but George Washington fought on the side of the British in the French and Indian War. That's because most Americans considered themselves to be British. And it's not until after the war that things get really dicey between British Americans and Great Britain. And in fact, if you notice, I'm always calling them British Americans. I'm not calling them Americans. They didn't think of themselves as Americans at the time. That changed, and Mrs. Rogers is going to tell you how that changed in the next couple of weeks. But the British didn't do very well in this war in the beginning, and we can see this is the famous Battle of the Monongahela, and in fact, we actually see George Washington in this picture wearing a blue uniform. He is a aide-de-camp. He is an assistant to the British General, General Bradstreet. General Bradstreet gets killed, and the British take a lot of losses. And in fact, in the beginning of the war, they are losing the battle. And we can see, can anyone tell me what the people in the foreground, in the front here, what are they? Right, but what kind of, if you had to identify them as people, what would you call them? Native Americans, Indians. By the way, I have a lot of friends who are Indians, and they call themselves Indians. I know we call them Native Americans sometimes, the word Aboriginal or Indigenous, but Indians is, when I go to Oklahoma, where I have a lot of friends who are Indians, they call themselves Indians. But there's also a Frenchman here. In fact, there are a number of Frenchmen here. So this is one of the reasons the English begin to call it the French and Indian War. In Canada, they call it the English and Indian War. But Great Britain wins the war. So why do they win the war? One of the reasons they win the war is they bring a lot of troops over. And these are Scottish troops. These are Highlanders. And you notice we can tell because they're wearing kilts. They're wearing, I guess, skirts, we would call them. And they become very good at fighting in the woods. They're not English, they're Scottish. They're part of the British Empire, just like New York is part of the British Empire, just like Virginia is part of the British Empire. And they're willing to fight for the king because they see that their lives are going to be better if they win this war. We also have a lot of Americans, and these are Rogers Rangers, and you can see they're a little bit more equipped for fighting in the woods. They're wearing green buckskins. They dyed their buckskins green, but they're using muskets. They're using traditional European weapons, but they've built in a little bit of Indian technology. You'll notice one of them, the man kneeling in the center, he's wearing snowshoes. That's Native American technology. But what I want you to know is 24,000 British Americans fought for Britain, and we can see them in their uniforms. Some of them are wearing red uniforms. Sometimes they wore blue uniforms. Each unit, each regiment had its own uniform, and that was to help identify it. It was very important that you could see your friends and tell them apart from your enemies. That's why wearing bright uniforms wasn't a bad idea. A lot of times we learn, oh, it was very silly to wear red, but it was a really good idea if you wanted to find out who was your friend and who wasn't. So the uniforms were very important. And in fact, there are battles in the American Revolution that the Americans almost lose because they don't have good uniforms and they can't tell themselves apart once the battle starts because it gets really smoky and really noisy. But we can see that there are two British Americans wearing red uniforms, and they look just like British soldiers. That's because they considered themselves to be British, just British people who were born in North America. The man in the middle, he's wearing a brown uniform. Again, the uniforms could be different. They weren't all red, they weren't all blue, they weren't all brown, they weren't all green. And 24,000 British soldiers fought in North America. And we can see they have more of what we consider the traditional British uniform, the red coats. And the British also were able to use their massive economic power. And they were able to use the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy, I haven't talked about, but the Royal Navy is a big factor for why the British win. They're able to sail up the St. Lawrence River, and we can see here they're climbing the heights of Quebec, and they win the Battle of Quebec in 1759. And that's a crucial battle because what it does is, if we look at our map of Indian trade routes, those blue arrows showing where the goods would come from France, what happens when Quebec is taken by the British in this really, really clever operation? They block the St. Lawrence River. And there are no more trade goods coming into places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. The only place to get trade goods now is from the English. And that means Native Americans who are dependent on things like firearms, like guns, like kettles, like steel axes, the only place they can get them are from British traders coming over the Appalachians. It's more expensive, but they can get it from the British. They can no longer get it from the French. They have no choice but to trade with the English and stop fighting the English because they have to feed their families. They have to go out and hunt. And bows and arrows are no longer easy to use. People have forgotten how to make them and how to use them. It takes a long time to get good at it. I want you to remember that the French and Indian War was actually a world war. Again, we are studying American history, and we tend to look at it from an American perspective. But it was really a world war. It was fought in Canada, just like I showed you. It was fought, of course, in Pennsylvania and in Maine, but it was also fought in Cuba. The British took the city of Havana. It was fought in Germany. And there we have the Prussian king, Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was so popular in North America that in Pennsylvania we still have a town called King of Prussia. It's named after Frederick the Great. And Frederick the Great is one of the great generals of all time. And there he is. He was such a brave king. He actually took the flag and led his men into battle. And that definitely got their attention, and they were happy to follow him into battle. It was fought in India. The French and Indian War was fought in India, in places like Bengal, Bangladesh, outside of Mumbai. These were important battles that helped the British establish their empire. It was fought in the Philippines. The British Navy took Manila off of the Spanish. And it was very important because people like George Washington learned their trade. They learned to fight effectively. And in fact, George Washington asked to become a British officer. He wanted to get a commission in the Royal Army, in the British Army, but the British turned him down because he was not born in England. And he didn't come from the right sort of family. What would have happened if George Washington had gotten that commission and become a British officer, had become Major Washington of the British Army? Things might have gone differently. Oh, one other place, I talked about the Philippines, I talked about India and places like that. Another country was involved in the French and Indian War, Russia. Russia fought in the French and Indian War, and they fought against the British. So most of us don't think about that, but this was a world war. And people like George Washington got their start from what they learned during the French and Indian War. Another person who got a big boost from it was this man. Can anyone tell me who this is?
You're right.
Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin.
What's different about this picture, though? Can anyone tell me? Does this look like what you've seen Benjamin Franklin in the past?
No.
Why? Why? Tell me.
Abby, why not?
Because I believe he's writing us. I don't remember the document, but I believe he's writing one of the important documents for America.
So you're used to seeing pictures of him writing?
Yeah, that's one reason. We don't see him doing that. What else is he doing? How about the way he's dressed? Is that the way you're used to seeing him dressed? No. He used to wear, when he went to France and he represented the United States, when it was actually the United States, he made sure he dressed down. He didn't wear that wig. He wanted to look very backwoodsy. He wanted to look very homespun. He wanted to look like, a backwoods farmer. He wasn't. He was the richest man in North America at the time. He was he was a media magnate. He was a media tycoon. He owned a lot of publishing firms, and he was extremely wealthy. And in fact, I had a fellowship when I was a graduate student from the Library Company of Philadelphia. Gave me money to do some studying, and that was actually started by Ben Franklin. So Ben Franklin's had a direct effect on my life. But what if I told you Ben Franklin spent most of the time in London and he was a lobbyist during these years? A lobbyist is somebody who represents a company or a country in a foreign or they represent a country to a government. So we have lobbyists today. For instance, the automobile industry hires attorneys and hires very intelligent people to go to Washington and tell the congressman, maybe you want to pass this law to help the auto industry. The oil industry has lobbyists. They send very intelligent people to Washington to help them get Congress to pass laws that will help the oil industry. Almost every industry has a lobbyist. School teachers have a lobby, and they send people to Washington to help Congress make decisions about what laws to pass to help people start and teach in schools. So lobbyists are people who represent, they're representatives who represent particular groups or particular sets of people or particular industries. Benjamin Franklin was a lobbyist for the colonies of New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Those colonies paid Ben Franklin to go to London to work on behalf of the colonies. And when Ben Franklin was there, he tried to become a noble. He tried to get a noble title. He wanted to become a baronet. He wanted the king to make him a noble. What would have happened if Ben Franklin had stayed in London as Lord Franklin instead of just Benjamin Franklin? And in fact, his son was actually, I believe his name was William, actually did get a title. and he was a loyalist, and he was the governor of New Jersey during the American Revolution. So you had a father who was a patriot, fought on the side of the United States, and you had a son who also considered himself patriotic, but patriotic to the King of England. So what I want you to understand is, at the end of the French and Indian War, British Americans had spent a lot of time and money, had fought very hard to help build the British Empire, and they were very, very happy to be part of the British Empire. But all of that's going to change. Mrs. Rogers is going to tell you how that changed. I'm going to end it here and give you a little chance to ask some questions. Does anybody have questions?
We only have a couple of minutes, and I had the kids write some questions ahead of time. Ollie, you want to read that question?
How much land did England own? Like how many miles or kilometers?
Well, could we answer that more on a worldwide scale? Professor Milne, I think it would be beneficial to the kids. How much land did the British Empire own at this time?
It depended who you asked. The British claimed all of what's today Canada. They also claimed all of what today is the United States up until the Mississippi River. That's just in the United States. That's just in North America. They also claimed Cuba. They gave the Philippines back. They got Florida. So Florida, Spanish Florida, becomes British Florida for a while. Not for a long time, but for about 25 years, Florida was a British colony. They also had colonies in India, and that was very important to the British. They also had colonies, I don't know if I'd call them colonies, but they had a lot of forts in Africa where they would kidnap Africans and sell them into slavery. So they had a global empire. If I were to give you an actual, I can't really answer your question and say, you know, X amount, this many millions of square miles, but it's a great amount of, figure a good chunk of North America, more than half of North America, for our purposes, for your purposes, and they started getting quite a bit of India at that time. So I would say several hundred million, you know, we're thinking in millions of square miles.
Yeah, we had one other question. Cal, would you read your question, please?
What were Indians in other parts of the United States doing during colonial times, like the war?
Yeah, that's a good question. That war affected Native Americans. I kept it in Pennsylvania. I kept it in the Great Lakes region, but it was also an important war in places like Mississippi or Alabama. It was very important for the Cherokees in places like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. They tended to side with the French in the beginning. Some Indians were smart enough to stay out of the entire war. The Choctaws and the Chickasaws, they liked the British, but they also were very close to the French, and they were pretty much neutral. If we go out into the far west, places like the Apaches actually did pretty well because English traders started coming further and further west, and some of them made it onto the Great Plains and as far as the Rocky Mountains. So it affected Native Americans different. It depended on which Native American group you were talking about.
We do want to give a sincere thank you to Oakland University's own Professor Milne for being with us today and giving us plenty of food for thought. We're really grateful for the opportunity to partner with and learn from you. Here's to many more Classroom Connections in the near future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.